There are other places in the solar system which are potentially extremely promising for currently active extant life now. So these would be the icy moons of Jupiter and Saturn.
Yes, Europa and Enceladus.
Yeah.
Which you said, Europa is one of Jupiter's, one of the Galilean moons.
Yep.
It's just a big ball of ice.
Yeah, I mean that's essentially what people thought of it for ages. Just a big ball of ice.
Yeah, and it's what size? It's about.
It's just a bit smaller than the moon.
Yeah. And then Enceladus is a moon of Saturn, which is tiny. It's like 500 kilometers or something.
Yeah, in diameter. Yeah, it's really small.
And our moon's like 3,000.
Yeah.
So it's very small, very tiny little thing, and that's also a ball of ice.
Yes, and that's the crazy thing about them. So for a while, like any pictures of them are just returned these sort of smooth, reflective ice balls. Mm-hmm. Which basically means, if you look at if you look at the surface of these things, you can see that there's few craters and there's very little of the build-up of evidence of impacts over billions of years that the rocky bodies in the solar system have, like the moon or Mercury.
Yes, exactly, or Mars even. Mars has got some craters that are covered over, but it has
shitloads of craters.
Lots of craters. The Earth has very few. Like fresh craters, and almost all of them have been destroyed by tectonics or life or some surface process that's turned over the surface, and you end up not accumulating these things. But these two, well, Enceladus has some cratering on it. In the northern part.
They both have craters.
Yes, they do. Yeah.
But they're remarkably smooth compared to other moons and other bodies in the solar system.
I think Europa's got not that many craters compared to what it should have.
It's one of the smoothest, most reflective bodies in the solar system.
Well, I think that one of the topographic high on it is something, the most, like the difference between the lowest and highest, it's like 100, 200 meters, something like that. It's very small.
Yeah.
So it's a very, like you say, very smooth body. But all this suggested that they've got fresh surfaces. There are active surface processes ongoing, seemingly at least all over Europa, and in the southern parts of Enceladus, on the southern pole, basically.
Yeah, because the north pole of Enceladus is a bit more cratered than the south pole.
Yeah.
So it seems like both of them have got ongoing active processes that are recycling the surface.
Yes.
In a similar way to the Earth, but obviously probably very different processes. Yeah. In some ways.
And you get so on Enceladus you get those big, what they call tiger stripes.
Yeah.
Which are kind of regions of where there's kind of silicates and organics, we think, types of clays, all sorts of things bubbling up. I don't know if they've not been sampled.
Yeah, they have. Sampled? Yeah. Cassini's done. Cassini is a mission in the Saturn system, which is basically it's been there since 97, or it's possibly launched in 97. I can't remember. Anyway, it's been there for ages, and it wasn't just meant to investigate Enceladus. It was meant to investigate the whole Saturn system, but it's got this thing called the Cosmic Dust Analyzer, which collects particles mainly because obviously Saturn has massive rings, so there's obviously a lot of dust flying around. Yeah. So they wanted to know what all that's made of. But actually, on this mission, they found, by looking at Enceladus, these giant plumes coming out of the South Pole. Yeah. And there are some pretty spectacular pictures of that, actually.
Yeah, I mean, to the point where I think it's the E-ring of Saturn.
Yeah.
Is where Enceladus lies, and they didn't know before, but actually it's composed of all the stuff that's been ejected out of Enceladus. Yeah. So this whole ring is all this crap being chucked out of Enceladus. Yeah. So I meant in terms of the spectra and stuff they've investigated, have the tiger stripes?
Yes, they have.
Roughly what? So is there clays?
The stuff that's coming out into the plumes. There's all kinds of stuff. There's obviously tons of water because it's being fed by what's thought to be. We'll get onto this in a second. A subsurface ocean. Yeah. So there's tons of water coming out, and in amongst all this water ice, these particles of water ice, you find silicates, so like clays and salts, things that you might find in seawater, and also a bunch of organic molecules. But the thing is, the Cassini spacecraft wasn't designed to be analysing these things in any great detail. No. So all they know is that there's some organics in there. Yeah, really. That's
sort of what I meant. Yeah, I didn't know what spectra and stuff they had gathered from Cassini. And then on Europa, they got a similar thing. These big regions of the European surface, the lineae, or these lines basically on the surface, these linear patterns that are, in them there are lots of these clays, lots of these sulfates, all sorts of different things that suggest that they're not fresh ice. They're regions that have had some input from silicate, water in contact with silicate minerals, basically, or active hydrothermal processes. So it looks like these things are effectively on Europa anyway, spreading in a lot of, sometimes in the fashion of seemingly plate tectonics. In fact, some people have said that it's maybe the only real evidence for another tectonically active body, but in sort of a cryotectonic system. Yeah,
so instead of rock,
in the solar system,
and magma driving it like we have on the Earth, it's water ice, and underneath liquid water driving like a system of moving plates, potentially subduction, like you find at plate boundaries, and all kinds of processes that end up resurfacing the surface. And
you get all sorts of other regions of like these chaotic terrains. They're called chaos terrains, where there seems to be plumes coming up that have broken up these strike, because you normally get these sort of what are probably spreading regions where it's pulling apart the ice, so you get these long lines, but where they've been broken up into pieces, and you can still see the long lines almost floating in little bits that are all like disorientated now, not lined up with each other anymore, in a kind of darker area of ice. So there's it looks like there's a plume that's come up and broken it all up. So there's lots of evidence of these kind of resurfacing processes through a sort of tectonic type system that we sort of see on Earth, and also through like the types of plumes you see on Earth, like magma plumes, but you see them.
So it actually seems
it's cryovolcanic processes that are some way analogous to the processes that resurface the surface of the Earth.
So actually, you're right. It actually seems like, at least broadly speaking, there's an analogy between plate tectonics on the Earth and
sort of cryotectonics.
Cryotectonics. And actually, as a bit of an aside, it's possible that a similar type of process might be happening on Pluto. From the New Horizons mission that flew by last year, all the images coming back showing these incredible pictures of active, essentially young surfaces and what look like active processes, and potentially similar tectonic sort of activity happening on Pluto. But anyway, so looking at both Europa and Enceladus and all this stuff about the active surfaces and the fact that they're built of water ice, and the fact that you're getting all these plumes of ejecting material from these cracks and stuff, it led people to the conclusion that there's oceans of liquid water under the surface.
I think there was some people did some modelling as well, looking at the changes in basically pressure and temperature you would get associated with those type of things on a body the size of Europa and Enceladus, and have done some maths basically that shows that at those pressures you'd expect the water to be the ice to become to become liquid. All the way down, in Europa's case, all the way down to the actual silicate core, which is crucial because the interaction between the silicates, the like rocky body in the middle of Europa, and that liquid water is really crucial for producing all the things you need for life.
The whole range of chemistry that you need.
If it was, I think it's, is it what's the moon of Jupiter? That's
Ganymede.
Is it Ganymede? Is it Ganymede or Callisto? Yeah, Ganymede.
I'm not sure. I don't know much about Callisto.
I think it's Ganymede.
Ganymede has a similar, so it has a water ice surface that looks pretty young. I mean, not as young as Europa.
No, it's cratered a bit more.
But it's a bigger moon.
And
what's thought to happen there is that you have a similar system. You go down, you have an icy crust, and then you go into a sort of a liquid layer.
As the pressure goes up,
And then as the pressure goes up even more, you go into these really weird sort of solid water phases that aren't really ice.
No.
So because obviously ice is less dense than water. So floats. If you put an ice cube in water, it floats and all that.
Sure.
So this is a phase of water that's more dense than the liquid phase because it's being compressed. So you might find in somewhere like Ganymede, even though it probably does have a rocky core in the same way that Europa.
With water, unfortunately, that water.
But that water is solid in some way. Some weird crystalline phase of water in Ganymede.
Which means it's probably not the best place to look for life, because there's the interactions would be quite different. And not as productive in producing lots of chemical speciation and things you might suggest would be related to the origin of life. We suspect that the origin of life is maybe related to, as we talked about before, and we'll probably do an episode on the origin of life, but a lot of the deep branching organisms are thermophiles, and that's led people to suggest that actually there's probably some link to that, because the first types of life on Earth were probably living from hydrothermal vents.
Yeah, because they generate all kinds of gradients in chemistry and gradients in pH and acidity and all that kind of stuff that you need to form basically what cells do.
Yeah.
Anyway,
broadly speaking, that's one of the more favoured environments for where life may have originated on Earth.
Yes.
Or anywhere.
And and so there's also, people have looked at the motion of the surface of Europa and Enceladus to a certain extent as well, and looked at how it's essentially decoupled from the motion of the actual moon itself, the core. Well,
Europa's tidally locked, isn't it, to Jupiter?
Yes.
And I think actually that what you're talking about, that decoupling from the rotation of the core and the ice crust.
Yeah.
You get certain patterns forming in these spreading zones on the surface of Europa, where the ice is being pulled apart, and that's particularly affected by the tides, the tidal forces exerted by Jupiter.
Yeah.
And they expected, if that was the case, to find really consistent patterns on certain parts of Europa, but they found that those patterns are there, but they keep changing positions and orientations, and that's because the silicate core and the ice core crust are decoupled and spin at different speeds. So you end up with a much weirder pattern than you'd expect, but you still see those features.
Yeah. So obviously all that implies that this thing is floating on top of a liquid layer, lubricating it from the core.
Yeah.
Yeah, and as we were just alluding to, the crucial thing for life is this contact between the core and the liquid layer, and there is evidence on both of these moons for that being the case.
Yes.
So on Europa, there's tons of material on the surface, like salts and clays and stuff, which you really only generate through liquid water rock interactions.
Yeah, it's similar to the evidence for liquid water on Mars.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And in Europa, the evidence, as I sort of said a while back, has come from analysing these ice grains that have come out from the giant plumes in the South Pole.
Yeah.
And again, they're full of, these clay minerals or whatever, salts and stuff, which suggest that it's not just like you have on Ganymede, where it's a liquid layer sandwiched between two ice layers, where you wouldn't have all that water-rock interaction.
Yeah.
It's actually in contact with the rocky core. Yeah. And on Enceladus, the cool thing is it's actually came out last year, but they reckon that some of what they find inside these ice grains in the plume, these tiny sort of particles of silica, which really need a hydrothermal source.
Oh, right, yeah.
So that sort of suggests that there's hydrothermal vents active inside Enceladus, potentially now, like now, there's active hydrothermal systems in Enceladus.
Yeah. So the heating for this hydrothermal production is generated by the tidal forces from the gas giants in which they're orbiting. So basically tidal heating, if you don't know what it is essentially the pull and friction generated by the distortion, by the gravitational forces of one of these huge gas giants distorting, or either distorts and kind of warps the ice crust and the silicate core, which generates heat. Or actually there's I think another type that's like tidal frictional heating, where the water currents change and that generates frictional heat as well. And that might be particularly important on Europa, I think.
Yeah.
So a large portion of the heat that's generated in the inside of these moons is from this tidal heating process. And it's particularly bad on Io, I think, which is why it's just spraying volcanoes all over the place. Yeah,
Io is like a firework.
Yeah.
It's really close to Jupiter, isn't it?
Yeah.
And that's the thing. I mean, tidal forces happen with any bodies that are interacting gravitationally. So the moon and the Earth exert tidal forces on each other. Obviously, the Earth's ocean tides come from that. But the moon will experiencing some tidal forces that contribute to its interior heating.
Exactly. So some of the Earth's internal heat is generated from the tidal forces of the moon and the sun and everything. Yeah. But it's just not a very big amount.
Yeah. So Jupiter's fucking massive. So it exerts a massive force on Europa and obviously Io. Saturn is also huge. and squashes Enceladus. But actually, there's some talk that the tidal forces on Enceladus aren't enough potentially to explain how much energy would need to drive its liquid water and all this.
Yeah, I mean, in both of the cases, there would be some input from the decay of radioactive isotopes, but generally that is not thought to be particularly significant on either of the two moons. It's very significant on Earth, for example, but not particularly significant on those two. Yeah,
which is kind of a bit of a puzzle, especially with Enceladus. I think with Europa, you can essentially account for its activity, the amount of energy you need to sustain its activity through tidal heating and radiogenic decay added together. Whereas with Enceladus, I think there's a bit of a discrepancy.
Okay.
And that's interesting because Pluto also
similar,
has this weird sort of discrepancy between what you'd calculate from, its tidal interactions with Charon, its moon.
Yeah.
With what you'd expect from that and what you actually see in terms of activity, the amount of energy you need for that.
Yeah.
So there's potentially something that we don't quite understand in terms of how to heat these bodies. Some other process potentially going on.
There may be a compositional thing or a gravitational something's happening that we can't quite account for at the moment.
Yeah.
Which is slightly mysterious because it's the sort of thing that you would have thought would have been. I kind of would have thought it might have been solved now. I mean, there's not. I mean, how many? I don't know. Odd.
Surely, what else is there? Some mysterious thing going on. I mean, what?
Yeah, it must be something's not being calculated properly.
Yeah, we have, maybe there's an input
attributed.
There's some input that hasn't been. There's been way underestimated in terms of its effect on these things, potentially.
Yeah, I mean, who knows? Who knows?
It's one of these things that are going to have to be solved.
Has Pluto got that much water?
Yes.
It's got some. I know it had some.
Yes.
It's got lots of frozen methane
fair amount,
and stuff.
Actually. Nitrogen as well.
Nitrogen, yeah.
It's got frozen nitrogen oceans and stuff.
That's nuts.
Yeah, just sort of large areas that are nitrogen ice.
Yeah.
On top of, I think it's a largely water ice bedrock sort of scenario. So you have mountains of water ice.
Yes.
Sort of sticking up through nitrogen. I mean, it's a crazy sounding place, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, that even might be a good place to go and look for life. Probably not.
Yeah, I mean, we don't
know that much about Pluto, really.
Presumably in the next sort of 12 months, you'll start seeing some real papers and data coming out of New Horizons.
Exactly.
At the moment, it's just been images that sort of the public and we've seen and whatever.
Yeah.
But once you start hearing, the people actually using that data to
and not all the data's come through, I don't think.
No.
So we'll continue to learn more about Pluto and maybe if it does have potential to be, somewhere that could support life. But I think we'll reserve judgment for that one until we hear some more information.
Yeah, for sure.
But these two are still our favoured.
Yeah, and it's that crucial combination of liquid water, which we know is there, and the fact that liquid water is in contact with that rocky core. Those are the two sort of things that make...
And that rocky core is actively
interacting. Essentially seems to be pumping out delicious nutrients into the ocean.
Yeah, it's hydrothermally.
Hydrothermal vents. And if you if you go into the deep oceans in the Earth and you find hydrothermal vents, isolated... Obviously, nothing. The Earth isn't a closed system, so nothing's truly isolated from anything, really.
No.
But seemingly isolated from sunlight, they have complex communities of organisms built up around them that are essentially gaining energy from the chemistry that's being supplied to them through the hydrothermal system.
Yeah, I mean, you find a barren desert of stuff, like the abyssal plains, just empty, almost nothing there. Yeah. The odd wandering, whale, and then you
abyssal plains is a badass.
I know, and then you reach the hydrothermal vents, and there's just covered in life.
Yeah,
and that's not a coincidence because there's a whole thing. Yes, exactly. There's a whole thing that's built up on those hydrothermal vents living there.
Yeah, so there's sort of an Earth-based precedent for thinking that even in these sort of dark, deep, high-pressure, cold ocean environments, where you have hydrothermal systems, you find life. So that's why these two moons are particularly exciting.
So how big's this ocean then, and on both of them?
Well, I mean, obviously the two moons are pretty different sizes, as we said, but. I mean, and we don't know for a start.
No, but the estimates.
So there are estimates. They use various measurements of gravity maps and the way that the way that the crust moves and all this kind of stuff, and density measurements are like a big deal as well. And
modelling the pressure, ice, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, a bunch of stuff.
Yeah,
some science stuff they do.
They do some science. Yeah,
they throw some science at it, and basically, so Europa has more. Their thought is that it has more liquid water than the Earth does.
That's nuts.
Which is crazy, yeah. And essentially what you're looking at is about 100 kilometers thick water layer on top of the rocky core, about 10 to 20 of which is ice.
So it's going to be mostly
liquid.
Mostly
looking at like 70 to somewhere between 70 to 80 to even 90 kilometers of liquid water.
And the deepest point in the ocean is like 11 kilometers?
On Earth, about 11 kilometers. Yeah, so
that's deep.
It's really deep, real deep. So that kind of think about that on Earth. The thought of sort of plunging down to the dark, crushing depths of the oceans. Yeah, and that's nothing. That's like scratching the surface of the Europa Ocean.
8 times further or something. Yeah, but yeah.
Just dark abyss.
That's huge.
Yeah, it's
80 kilometers deep.
It's massive. Yeah, it's absolutely massive. And
presumably the pressure's obviously going to be really high at the bottom of that, but because it's a smaller body, the gravity's going to be less.
Gravity's less, and people have calculated, roughly what that's going to be. And I think so. At the very bottom of the ocean, on the sea floor, you're looking at about sort of 2,500 Earth atmospheres, 2,500 bar.
2,500
which would be the equivalent of being at the bottom of a 26 or 25 kilometer deep ocean on Earth.
Okay, right. So then,
yeah. So that doesn't sound actually that bad.
Just over 2 times.
Yeah.
The pressure.
Yeah. So if you piled 2 Challenger deeps, which is the deepest point in the ocean, on top of each other,
plus a bit more,
plus a little bit more on Earth, then you've got probably what it's like at the very bottom of the ocean on Europa.
In terms of pressure, interesting.
Under the ice, it'll be obviously much less. But you're still looking at sort of about 90 bar or something like that.
But obviously, we're thinking in terms of if there is any interaction between, if there are hydrothermal vents, they're going to be at the bottom of the ocean.
Yeah, definitely.
And as a consequence, the pressure is going to be, if there is going to be life, then it's probably going to be around those types of things. It's going to have to be able to deal with very, very high pressure.
Yeah, sure.
In fact, at that high pressure, so the reason you get lots of organisms that are able to live at above boiling point temperatures is because they've all adapted to living in hydrothermal systems where the pressure's higher, so water remains liquid at a higher temperature. Presumably, they're going to be even higher pressure and higher temperature non-boiling hydrothermal systems here.
Yeah, you have the
fluids that are I don't know 150, 200 degrees.
That still
maybe
don't
not
boil.
That high, but that don't boil.
Yeah.
And so you might get organisms, if there are any organisms there, that are even more adapted to high temperatures than terrestrial organisms, if there is life there.
Yeah, it's definitely possible.
That's cool.
Yeah, it is cool. But so the thing is, obviously nobody knows exactly how these numbers play out in terms of the ice thickness and the ocean depth.
Sure.
The pressure at the bottom of the ocean is probably going to be fairly well known. I mean, that's probably fairly roughly accurate.
You can probably guess it.
Yeah. The thickness of the ice, there's a small camp of people that think it's really thin, so just a couple of kilometers.
Yeah. Oh right. Okay. Yeah.
On Europa.
A couple of kilometers.
Which basically would suggest
it's like a skin.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Basically would suggest that you actually have times when the ocean interacts directly with the surface of Europa. So cracks will form and you have upwelling water coming directly from the ocean.
Yeah.
And that's how you form these chaos terrain things that you were talking about earlier. But then I think most people think that the ocean, that the ice shell is more like 10 to 30 kilometers thick.
Yeah, and those types of chaos terrain are formed by
slightly more complex processes. Yeah, like sort of a bit like magma chambers, where you have water forming sort of chambers in the ice shell, which then feeds the formation of these chaos terrains and all that stuff.
Yeah, sure.
Still means that they could be good places to go, and because that water's going to have come from the ocean.
Sure.
They're still going to have contained all the good stuff that's in the ocean.
Well, you can go and sample it. You can go and sample the frozen ice at the top anyway.
Yeah, exactly.
If you don't want to go through the
so ice still shelf. Looking for the youngest sort of chaos terrain on Europa could be a good place to go and look.
Yeah.
Potentially to sample the ocean. But anyway, so it's probably about 10 to 30 kilometers. So 10 to 30 kilometers of solid ice.
Yeah, it's big.
Pretty crazy.
That's big. It's a lot of ice.
Yeah.
What about Enceladus?
So Enceladus is pretty different, slightly different story. I think until very recently, and literally until the last couple of years, it was thought that because the north is heavily cratered and the south has got where these like giant
big
plumes
tiger stripes are.
It looked like, okay, all the activities at the south. Therefore, if there is any subsurface water, it's going to be localized to the south. So maybe sort of a regional sea or sort of lake sort of thing going on.
Or just lots of plumes that come up or something. Or there's like those lines are spreading zones or something in Europa's like silicate. Sorry, yeah, Enceladus is silicate core.
Yeah.
And so you end up with these sort of heat lines that are
and it's melted like a pocket of water ice there.
And you get little, these kind of plumes of water coming up or whatever. Maybe there's a localized lake around like a deep subsurface.
Which would mean that, considering that Enceladus is only 500 kilometers in diameter, it would mean that the liquid water region on Enceladus is actually pretty small.
Yeah.
But actually recently, people have started saying that it's a global ocean. And again, this is based on measurements of how the moon moves or whatever. I don't fully understand. I don't understand it at all, really, exactly how the measurements work.
Yes,
but basically, it's to do with the wobble of the moon and saying that motion in that certain way would only be explained if the surface was not fixed to the core.
Okay.
So floating on top of something, liquid water.
So they say so
that basically means that there's probably a global ocean under Enceladus as well.
But doesn't explain the crater.
Doesn't explain the crater difference. Doesn't explain why the south is active and the north seems to not be active.
Yeah,
which is strange.
When we were talking about this earlier, I think you mentioned that maybe it's somewhat like Mars.
Well, I was completely
sure.
Yeah,
just hypothetically, because Mars has a very uneven distribution of heat over its surface in terms of it's got that big bulge, the Tharsis bulge, which is where most of the volcanics on Mars. There's some areas around that are spotted, but that's the main area of uplift and volcanism and stuff on Mars. Maybe there's something similar on Enceladus where it actually releases it in one kind of bulgy pocket.
Yeah, it's possible.
Yeah, absolutely.
Sure. But anyway, so I think the thought is that the ice shell could be tens of kilometers thick, but the water ocean is probably about 30 kilometers based on these measurements. Who knows? It could be very different depending where you are on the planet. I guess on the moon as well. It could be much deeper in the south, for example, if it's hotter. Anyway, so both of them seem to have global oceans. Europa has a shitload more water though, in terms of volume.
Yeah. And so they're obviously we talked about they're good places for life because of hydrothermal systems. Yeah. They've got similarities to other Earth environments as well.
Yeah.
If we look into Antarctica, these types of places, you do, and they've been talked about for a while as being potential analogues for the deep subsurface of Europa. Are these subglacial lake systems?
Yes.
The most famous is probably Lake Vostok.
Yeah, big one in Antarctica.
Huge lake. Is it the size of lake one of the big Great Lakes or something like that?
It's getting up that way. I'm not sure of the numbers. It's a big lake.
Yeah, and there was for some time thought that maybe this lake had been cut off from the surface. I remember hearing about this when I was younger and being like, oh, this is so
sort of
cool.
mind-blowing.
It had been cut off since before the Antarctic was frozen over, which was hundreds of thousands of years ago. They might have some crazy divergent evolution going on with stuff that was trapped in there.
Yes.
It's maybe not quite as simple as that now, I don't think.
Yeah, it's now thought to be potentially connected with other subglacial lakes and potentially even with the oceans.
Which then connect to the sea, essentially.
Yeah.
So there is maybe an input of stuff from the ocean that means that life and nutrients and things are being supplied to these environments. And so maybe it's not the perfect analog in a sense. But I mean... who knows? Because obviously there's going to be stuff being produced in Europa. I'm just saying, then obviously they haven't got hydrothermal vents and stuff in them, so they're maybe not the sort of place that you would expect life to start. But we can see by looking at these lakes that life does exist there.
Yeah, isolated under. I mean, Lake Vostok is under. It's like 3,000 meters of ice. Yeah, it's really deep. So it's completely ice sealed by a huge head of ice, and you have. Thriving microbial communities down there.
Yeah, I think they're sort of there's not much nutrients and carbon and stuff.
Pretty limited.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's not like it's not particularly a high biodiversity. There's not much there.
So when I say thriving, it's not thriving.
It's not really thriving, but there's stuff that's happy to live there.
Yes.
Stuff that can live there.
Yeah, there's active life.
Yeah.
There's active microbial life.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And they're potentially getting their nutrients from, outside of the lake or from lake sediments or things being washed in or whatever.
Yeah. But in the dark, so no access to sunlight, so there's no photosynthesis down there, which is a very similar situation, obviously in the interior of icy moons.
Yes, it's worth probably mentioning that these lakes, the life in these lakes is single-celled organisms. It's not.
Yes.
I don't think there's been any evidence of things like fish or whatever.
Well, apart from there was one that was sampled. Quite shallow one near the sea somewhere,
and they found
fish. Yeah, but that was more just a demonstration that these things must be linked to the sea.
Yeah.
Whereas things like Vostok, absolutely, deep, cold, high pressure. And low, essentially, really crucially low nutrients.
Even in the wider ocean, you only really find large amounts of bigger multicellular organisms, fish and stuff, around upwellings, where there's plankton and things feeding on nutrients being washed up.
And in the shallows.
Or in the shallows, yeah. Most of the ocean is empty.
Yeah, especially the deep ocean. It's like a desert.
Yeah.
So there's plenty of these Antarctic lakes. Some of them have been directly sampled, like Lake Whillans.
Yeah.
It's not quite as deep as Vostok, but it's been sampled. And there's plenty of others, potentially some under Greenland as well, which is the second biggest sort of ice cap on the Earth.
Yeah.
So all of these could be good
analogous.
It would be really cool to find one that had some kind of hydrothermal input. I wonder if that exists. I don't think there's any reason why it shouldn't.
I think there are.
In fact, Iceland, underneath the Vatnajökull ice cap on Iceland, there's almost certainly hydrothermal systems.
Yeah.
In fact, there definitely would be.
Yeah. They're not so. There will be. They're not going to be very large lake systems that have hydrothermal bits in, are they? Or are they? Like not the size of Vostok.
Not the size of Vostok. No.
Big,
no.
Especially, hydrothermal systems.
Yeah, I mean that's just on a different scale in terms of depth of ice, the size of the lake.
Yeah.
I mean the lake's probably bigger than the whole ice cap in Iceland.
Yes.
But yeah, so it would be cool to find somewhere that's
a really big isolated lake with hydrothermal systems. I don't know if there's any thought to be. I mean, Antarctica doesn't have that much in the way of.
It's got active volcanism, Antarctica.
Bit of it, yeah.
Yeah.
Wonder if there's anything, maybe the undiscovered lake that does have that in it. And actually, that would be the kind of prime example of something. If you found down there, like teeming with life around a hydrothermal vent in a deep subglacial, below the a huge ice cap lake. That's that
one of those
really
like oases of life, just covered in stuff.
Yeah, but under an ice sheet.
Yeah, I mean, get to Europa now.
But as we said before, just because there's potentially an inhabitable habitat on Mars.
Anywhere off the Earth.
Anywhere, yeah. But on Europa or Enceladus doesn't mean there's life there.
No, we don't know. We essentially don't know
much about the origin of life.
The relationship between habitable and inhabited. It could be that there's a lot more you need than just being habitable. It could be extremely rare. We just don't know.
Yeah,
we don't know.
Yeah. But if we think about Europa and Enceladus in comparison to those environments on Earth, they do have some differences. That are worth highlighting, because it might mean that life is potentially renders them uninhabitable, or life finds it much more difficult to start. So forgetting the starting of life in terms of input of carbon and these types of things to the environment, things that the organisms can use to grow. Most of the environments we've discussed here, hydrothermal, and not so much hydrothermal, but these glacial lakes anyway, and these big lakes, there are huge amounts of carbon that's been input, or some carbon that's been input from the surrounding environment, which is eventually most of it come from photosynthetic.
You can trace it back to photosynthesis somehow.
There's some carbon raining down on the hydrothermal vents, although obviously there's a lot more. There's a lot of sort of in situ carbon being created there.
Yeah.
Because otherwise, the rest of the surface of the bottom of the ocean would, also have a lot more life there.
Yeah.
Although there's a lot more energy and nutrients and things coming out. So
yeah.
Maybe that's the reason, and it's not the carbon that's so limiting.
Yeah, it's possible.
But anyway, there are inputs from the rest of the biosphere essentially in these two environments we've discussed that are not, maybe not as there's not going to be no photosynthetic life on Europa because it's all going to be below the surface, dark, horrible. There's going to be
dark and horrible,
dark and grim,
both of those things.
And so, we're not going to see these types, the same structure of biosphere there.
Yeah, sure. It's going to be all of the input for energy and for carbon is going to have to come from what's called chemosynthesis or chemotrophy, which is essentially just using chemical energy. So photosynthesis uses energy from the sun to essentially fix carbon, turn carbon dioxide in the atmosphere into biological material. That process will have to be fueled entirely by chemical reactions in somewhere like Enceladus or Europa. And that's the thought, that is that the raw materials to do that could be supplied by hydrothermal vents. But it could be that that's not the case. It could be that our understanding of how hydrothermal systems and mid-ocean ridges and all the kind of things that might form hydrothermal vents on Earth just might not be happening in the same way in somewhere like Europa or Enceladus. It's possible that that rocky core is dissipating heat in a slightly different way to what we see on Earth.
Sure.
And that you don't find these vent structures in the same way.
Yes, exactly. It might be actually quite barren down there.
Yeah.
In terms of there might not, even though there is an active core which has a lot of tidal heating going on and whatnot, there isn't actually a huge amount of hydrothermal interaction. Maybe.
Yeah. I mean,
there's quite a lot of evidence for the things like formation of phyllosilicates and stuff. I suppose you don't necessarily need hydrothermal systems for that.
But what it could be, and again, this is massively just speculative, like hand wavy nonsense.
Yeah.
But what it could be is that
that's what we do best.
To actually form sustained vent systems or any kind of conduit on the Earth to get heat out from deep underground up into the oceans or whatever. That part of that is to do with the properties of the crust of the Earth.
Sure.
And it could be that under the certain temperature and pressure regimes at the bottom of the European Ocean, that the properties, sort of the physical properties of the crust, are such that the vent openings don't stay open for the same length of times. You might have sort of like a volcanic event that spews a bunch of heat out, but then the crust, because it's slightly more malleable or whatever, doesn't stay open to the same length. So you might not have sustained vents that stay open for the same length of time that you do on the Earth.
That might be okay for feeding a biosphere, but it might mean that you can't get
something started.
Yeah, I mean, speculatively.
Yeah, massively speculatively.
But yeah, maybe that would be a barrier to life evolving independently there.
Yeah.
Of somewhere like the Earth, without transfer between the two.
There's also a bunch of other weird shit that could be going on icy moons.
Yeah.
That we don't see on Earth at all.
No.
So, for example, the fact that the surface of these things, so the outside surface above the icy layer, is just being smashed with all the radiation from...
I don't think Enceladus is as badly, is it?
I don't know.
I think Enceladus is okay.
It's not so bad.
Europa's particularly bad for radiation.
Destroyed by radiation.
Yeah.
The magnetosphere of Jupiter is just like a storm of highly charged particles.
Yeah, just
to the extent that
accelerating these things from all over the place. Yes.
To the extent that, and we'll talk about this again in future, but to the extent that it's very difficult to put a lander on Europa because it's just going to get rinsed by radiation.
Yes.
And the knock-on effect of that is that it does all kinds of stuff. The high energy radiation does all kinds of stuff to the chemistry of the surface.
Yeah.
Generates oxygen for a start. It splits up water, generates oxygen.
And hydrogen peroxide.
And all these other kind of oxidative forms of oxygen that are really damaging to
life's not enjoying it.
Not liking it at all.
So if that shit's getting subducted out from the ice crust down into the ocean, then and potentially concentrating, you could have an ocean that's actually sort of bleached.
It's an ocean of bleach.
Yeah, which would not be ideal because generally life's not a big fan of that. Although some people have hypothesized that hydrogen peroxide could potentially be a solvent for life and all this kind of shit.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe, but in terms of Earth life...
in terms of life that we know, that we can actually comment on.
Yeah.
And it would probably be kind of bad.
Yeah.
So I have heard some people say that you could have a delivery of actually oxygen into the interior of Europa through this mechanism, which means that you can actually have essentially an oxygenated ocean and support fish and whales. Well, not whales, fish.
Well, those fish rely
on oxygen respiring stuff.
Yeah, but then the fish and things rely a lot on the carbon delivered from
like photosynthesis. Yeah. So if you're limited by that still, then obviously
maybe that's still a problem. But you could have maybe more complex organisms if you had oxygen down there.
Yes,
if you had enough carbon.
It's a tipping point. If you deliver too much of this oxidative crap into the ocean, then it's going to be potentially really, really bad.
Yes.
Really stressful.
And you don't get anything like that we don't see anything like that organisms have to deal with on Earth.
No.
So actually these things may be horrid places to look for life.
Yeah.
If there's not much interaction between the silicate and the ocean, in the sense that there's not many hydrothermal vents, and the water itself is full of hydrogen peroxide and is quite a concentrated, low nutrient but fairly poisonous place without any light input. Actually, it's not a great place to look for life. We don't know any of this because we haven't sampled it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So that's what we need to do. We need to go and sample it.
I don't know about Enceladus being slightly better for that sort of thing, though.
Yes. I'm not sure. If it doesn't have the same kind of radiation environment on the surface.
I'm sure it's not as extreme.
Yeah, I think you're probably right there.
But I don't know. I think it's quite a lot less extreme, but I'm not 100%
Yeah, well, its orbit is very different to that of Europa's. Europa's in some kind of resonance with one of the other moons.
Yeah.
Dion, I think. Or is that Saturn? I can't remember.
I can't remember.
And it's in this particular
it's in the
particular
Van Halen
part,
belt, whatever they're called.
Yeah, that's
not
it.
Van Halen belts. Is that
the Van Halen belt?
I can't remember.
You're right. It's in some kind of region of Jupiter's magnetosphere, which means it's particularly savage.
Getting pwned.
Yeah, it's getting rinsed. Which is fine for if that's the radiation itself is not going to be directly causing a problem for life.
No, because it wouldn't go through the
under
ice.
30 kilometers of ice.
Yeah.
That's fine.
And water and ice are very good barriers to radiation.
Yeah. So that the radiation itself isn't so much of an issue.
No.
Directly, it's the fact that it can generate all this dodgy chemistry that's then getting sucked into the ocean by the plate tectonics, essentially.
Yeah, by the 10%. Yeah, definitely.